She thought she was helping a little girl bleeding in the street, until the most feared Korean mafia boss stormed into the ER demanding the stranger who saved his daughter. The rain hammered the cafe windows like fists trying to break inside. Every rumble of thunder rattled the old floorboards, and I reminded myself again that this part of the city wasn't where nursing students like me were supposed to dream. But at 20 years old, this cafe and the textbooks on the counter were all I had to my name. I was counting the register, pretending the storm outside didn't feel like a warning, when a screech of tires cut through the thunder. I was halfway to turning the sign to closed when lightning split the sky. For a heartbeat, the street lit up like daylight, and that's when I saw the horror. A black sedan swerving, a tiny figure in a yellow raincoat, a sickening thud that I felt in my own bones. My pulse stumbled. I didn't see a mafia princess. I saw a patient, someone who wouldn't last 5 minutes if I didn't act. I should have stayed behind the counter. I should have waited for the police. Instead, I grabbed my medical kit and threw open the door. And that one decision, running out into the rain, would change my life forever. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The hospital room was sterile and silent, save for the rhythmic, haunting beep of the heart monitor. Jin-Ryu stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a jagged, dark line against the morning light. He still wore the tailored black suit from the night before, though his unbuttoned collar and the slight disarray of his slicked-back hair betrayed the turmoil beneath his iron composure. He looked less like a grieving father and more like a predator contemplating its next move. Sable sat by the bed, her hand still anchored to Gia's small, pale one. She hadn't slept. Her cardigan was damp, her casual dress wrinkled, but her eyes remained sharp, focused on the steady rise and fall of the little girl's chest. When Jean finally turned, the gold chain around his neck caught the light, glinting with a cold metallic authority. "The doctors tell me you stabilized her before the paramedics even arrived," Jean said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to command the very air in the room. "They say without your intervention, my daughter wouldn't have made it to the operating table." Sable didn't flinch at the intensity of his stare. "I'm a nursing student, Mr. Ryu. I did what anyone with my training would have done." "No," Jean countered, stepping closer. The air grew heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and ozone. "Anyone else would have called the police and waited behind their locked door. You ran into a storm for a stranger. That kind of loyalty is a currency I find very rare." He pulled a heavy, cream-colored envelope from his pocket and set it on the bedside table. "Gia's mother is gone. My world is complicated. Since she woke up an hour ago, she hasn't let go of your sleeve. She's terrified, and you are the only person she associates with safety." Sable looked down at Gia, whose eyes were fluttered shut in a fitful sleep. The girl's grip on her hand tightened even in her dreams. "I'm offering you a position as her private medical guardian," Jean continued. "You will live on the estate. You will oversee her recovery. In exchange, I will pay off your grandmother's debts, cover your tuition in full, and provide a salary that will ensure you never have to wipe down another cafe counter again." Sable felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was an offer that sounded like a rescue but looked like a surrender. "And if I say no? Then I thank you for her life and we never speak again," Jean said, though his eyes suggested that losing the only person his daughter trusted was not an option he would easily accept. "But look at her, Sable. She's drowning. Be her life raft." 2 hours later, Sable found herself in the back of a blacked-out SUV, moving through the iron gates of the Ryu estate. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress. High stone walls topped with electrified wire gave way to manicured, silent gardens where men in earpieces stood like statues among the hedges. As the car pulled up to the massive limestone manor, the door was opened by a man who didn't smile. Sable stepped out, feeling small and terribly exposed in her simple cardigan. Jean led the way, his stride echoing against the marble floors of the foyer. The interior was a masterpiece of cold elegance. Minimalist art, shadow-filled corners, and a silence so thick it felt intentional. They reached a set of double doors on the second floor. Jean paused, his hand on the handle. For a fleeting second, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped, revealing a flicker of raw, aching helplessness. "She hasn't spoken a word since the accident," he whispered, almost to himself. They entered the room. It was a beautiful sun-drenched nursery, filled with every toy a child could want. Yet Jia sat in the center of the bed like a porcelain doll with broken springs. She was staring at the wall, her eyes vacant and glazed with a trauma too deep for her years. Sable walked past Jean and sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't speak. She didn't try to force a hug. She simply reached out and placed her hand on the mattress, palm up. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then slowly Jia turned her head. Her small lip trembled as she crawled across the silk sheets and tucked herself into Sable's side, hiding her face in the nurse's sweater. Jean watched from the doorway, his muscular frame framed by the shadows of the hall. He saw his daughter breathe a sigh of relief for the first time in 24 hours. He saw the golden cage finally have its keeper. He turned away before Sable could see the flash of gratitude in his eyes, his phone already at his ear, his voice dropping back into the cold, threatening tone of a man who was ready to go to war for the peace he had just purchased. The transition from the chaos of the streets to the suffocating stillness of the Ryu estate felt like moving underwater. For 3 weeks, Sable lived within the limestone walls of the fortress, her world shrinking to the size of Jia's bedroom and the sprawling, silent gardens that surrounded it. To the outside world, Jin Ryu was a titan of industry and a shadow of terror. But within these walls he was a ghost. He appeared only in the late hours, his heavy footsteps echoing in the corridor outside Jia's door, pausing for a heartbeat before moving on, never entering. Jia remained a statue of grief. She ate when prompted and slept when tucked in, but her voice was a locked vault. The trauma of the hit and run had settled into her bones, turning the vibrant child into a silent specter who followed Sable like a shadow. Sable knew that medical charts and heart rate monitors wouldn't reach the girl. She needed a bridge that didn't require words. On a Tuesday afternoon, as the rain drizzled against the reinforced glass of the nursery, Sable spread a massive roll of white butcher paper across the floor. She set out jars of vibrant acrylics, crimson cerulean, and a gold that reminded her of the chain Jean wore around his neck. Jia sat on the edge of her bed, watching with large, hollow eyes. Sable didn't ask her to join. Instead, she dipped her own fingers into the cool blue paint and dragged them across the paper in a long sweeping arc. "My grandmother used to say that when the world gets too loud, you have to find a way to let the colors speak for you," Sable murmured, her voice a soft anchor in the quiet room. She began to paint a stormy sea, the blue swirling into white-capped peaks. For a long time Jia didn't move. Then the soft rustle of silk signaled her descent from the bed. She knelt at the edge of the paper, her small hand hovering over a jar of bright sun-yellow paint. With agonizing slowness, she dipped a single finger into the jar and pressed it onto the center of Sable's stormy sea. A small trembling sun. Far below in the high-tech sanctuary of the estate's security hub, Jin Ryu sat in a leather chair, surrounded by glowing monitors. His jacket was discarded, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms mapped with ink and old scars. His eyes were fixed on screen 7. He had spent his life watching people, watching for betrayal, watching for weakness, watching for death. But as he watched the small girl on the screen smear a streak of yellow across the paper, his breath hitched. He watched through the camera as Sable smiled, not a professional smile, but a warm, radiant expression that seemed to light up the sterile room. Sable leaned in and whispered something, then handed Jia a brush. On the screen, Jia's shoulders shook. Sable pulled the girl into her lap, wrapping her arms around the small frame as the first sob broke through the silence. It wasn't just a cry, it was a release. And then it happened. A sound so faint the high-definition microphones barely caught it, but to Jean it was louder than a gunshot. "Papa," Jia whispered into Sable's sweater. "I want Papa." Jin's hand tightened around the armrest of his chair until the leather groaned. A single hot tear traced a path down his cheek, a physical manifestation of a crack in a heart he had spent 20 years turning to stone. He watched Sable rock his daughter back and forth, her dark skin a beautiful contrast against Jia's pale cheek, and he realized that the woman he had hired to be a guardian had become something far more dangerous. She had become the only person capable of making him feel. He stood up abruptly, unable to watch any longer. He needed to be the monster the world expected him to be, especially now that his enemies were circling. But as he walked toward the elevator, his footsteps felt lighter. The silence of the house had finally been broken, and for the first time since the accident, the Iron Lion of Soul felt like he had something worth losing. The heavy scent of metallic copper preceded Jean into the library long before he stepped into the light of the fireplace. When he finally emerged from the shadows, the sight of him stopped the breath in Sable's lungs. His tailored charcoal blazer was shredded at the shoulder, the silk lining weeping a dark rhythmic crimson that stained his white dress shirt nearly black. He didn't stumble. Even with the face drained of color, Jean moved with a predatory, agonizing grace, sinking into the leather wingback chair. "The kit," he rasped, his voice a low vibration that broke on the last syllable. "Top drawer of the mahogany desk. Now Sable." Her hand shook as she retrieved the medical box. She had spent weeks viewing Jean as an untouchable architect of chaos, a man of ironed creases and cold commands. Seeing him broken was a jarring shift in the physics of her world. As she knelt beside him, the heat radiating from his body was feverish, clashing with the winter chill clinging to his coat. "I'm not a doctor, Jean," she whispered, her fingers fumbling with the latch of the kit. "You have steady hands," he countered, his eyes fluttering shut. "That's all I need. Cut the shirt away." Sable took the surgical shears, the cold steel clicking against the silence of the room. As she peeled back the ruined fabric, the boss began to dissolve. Beneath the expensive wool and the reputation for cruelty, lay a landscape of old silver scars and fresh, jagged trauma. The bullet had grazed his collarbone, leaving a furrow of ruined flesh that pulsed with every shallow breath he took. She began to clean the wound, her movements hesitant at first until she saw his jaw tighten, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests. He didn't cry out. He simply endured. "Why didn't you go to a clinic?" she asked, dabbing away the blood to reveal the angry red edges of the tear. "Weakness is a scent," Jean murmured, his head falling back against the leather. "If I bleed in public, the sharks circle. Here, it's just us." The admission felt heavier than the silence. For the first time, Sable wasn't looking at a monster or a master. She was looking at a man who was profoundly, dangerously exhausted. As she applied the antiseptic, he hissed, his hand instinctively flying up to catch her wrist. His grip was iron, but his palm was damp with cold sweat. They stayed frozen like that for a heartbeat, Sable pinned by his gaze, which had lost its sharp, calculating edge. In its place was a raw, animal vulnerability. He looked at her not as a pawn, but as a lifeline. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship since the first day shifted, tilting into something far more intimate and terrifying. "You're shaking," he noted softly, though he didn't let go of her arm. "I've never seen someone bleed like this," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the hearth. Jin's grip loosened, his fingers tracing the pulse point in her wrist for a fleeting second before his hand dropped away. "It's just blood, Sable. It's the most honest thing about me." She finished the dressing in silence, her movements growing more confident as she taped the gauze into place. When she finally leaned back, her knees aching from the hard floor, she realized her own hands were stained. She looked at the crimson on her skin, then back at Jean. He had fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep, his features finally relaxed of the tension that usually held them in a mask of indifference. He looked younger. He looked fragile. The tailored suit lay in a ruined heap on the floor, and without it, the myth of the man felt mortal. Sable stayed on the floor at his feet long after the task was done, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, realizing that knowing he could bleed made him far more dangerous to her heart than he had ever been to her life. The morning light filtered through the library's tall windows, thin and gray, casting long shadows that seemed to cling to the furniture. Jean was gone. Only the faint, lingering scent of antiseptic and the dark, stiffened stains on the Persian rug remained as proof of the midnight surgery. Sable felt a hollow ache in her chest as she stared at the empty wingback chair. The intimacy of the previous night felt like a fever dream that had broken with the dawn. She found the first sign of the outside world on the silver breakfast tray left outside her door. It wasn't the usual porcelain pot of Earl Grey or the folded newspaper. Tucked beneath the handle of the creamer was a small, hand-folded origami crane, crafted from paper so black it seemed to absorb the light. Sable picked it up, her heart stuttering. As she unfolded the intricate creases, a single line of elegant, hurried script was revealed on the inside. The debt of a king is paid in the blood of his subjects. Run before the ledger is balanced. There was no signature, no seal, only the chilling realization that someone had bypassed Jin's extensive security to place a death warrant on her breakfast tray. The walls of the estate, which had once felt like a gilded cage, suddenly felt like a glass box. Sable moved to the window, pulling the heavy velvet curtain back just enough to peer out at the manicured grounds. The guards were there, standing like statues in their dark overcoats, but she no longer saw them as protectors. They were markers, beacons that told the world exactly where Jin's most vulnerable assets were kept. She spent the afternoon in a state of vibrating hyper-awareness. Every floorboard creak sounded like a footstep. Every rustle of the winter wind against the glass sounded like a whispered threat. She realized then that the humanity she had seen in Jin the night before was a liability. His enemies didn't care about the man beneath the suit. They only cared that he had bled, and that she was the one who had seen it. While crossing the grand foyer to reach the kitchen, she noticed a black sedan idling at the end of the long winding driveway. It sat just beyond the iron gates, its windows tinted to avoid like opacity. It didn't move, didn't honk. It simply watched. Miss Sable. She jumped, a small cry escaping her throat as she turned to find Jin's lead head of security, a man named Elias, standing in the shadows of the hallway. He looked at the crumpled black paper in her hand with eyes that were entirely too knowing. "The boss is in meetings all day," Elias said, his voice a flat, tonal vacuum. "He requested that you remain in the internal quarters. For your own comfort, of course." "Comfort?" Sable asked, her voice trembling. "Elias, there was a message on my tray. Someone was in my room." Elias didn't blink. "The Crane Syndicate is fond of theatrics. They want you to feel the shadow before the strike. It's a psychological tactic to make the target bolt into the open." He took a step closer, his presence looming. "Do not bolt, Sable. Outside these walls, you are merely a message Jin hasn't read yet. Inside, you are a complication they have to work to reach." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just a guest or a captive anymore. She was a target. By tending to Jin's wounds, she had stepped out of the periphery and into the crosshairs. The shadow of the crane wasn't just a warning. It was a mark. She retreated to her room, locking the door and leaning her back against the heavy wood. The silence of the house felt heavy, suffocating. She looked down at the black paper in her hand, now crushed into a shapeless ball. Jin's world was no longer something she was merely observing. It was a tide that had finally pulled her under, and the shore was nowhere in sight. The transition from the cold, sterile isolation of the estate to the sensory explosion of the night market was jarring. Jin had insisted on the outing with a sudden, sharp intensity, as if he could manufacture normalcy through sheer force of will. He wore a simple black turtleneck and a wool coat, his injured shoulder stiff but hidden, while Sable walked beside him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The market was a labyrinth of steam and neon. The air tasted of charred sugar, ginger, and diesel. Crowds of tourists and locals pressed in from all sides. A sea of anonymity that should have felt safe, yet only made Sable feel more exposed. Jin walked closer than he ever had, his arm occasionally brushing hers. It wasn't an embrace, it was a perimeter. "Look at the lanterns, Sable," Jin murmured, his voice low and grounding near her ear. "Forget the gates for one night. Choose something. Anything." She looked at a stall draped in silk fans, trying to summon an interest in the vibrant colors, but her eyes kept darting to the rooftops. Every shadow between the neon signs looked like a silhouette. Every camera lens held by a tourist looked like a scope. "I feel like a ghost walking through a world I don't belong to anymore." she whispered, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. Jean stopped at a small vendor selling glass-beaded jewelry. He picked up a delicate amber bracelet, holding it up to the light. For a moment, the hardness in his face softened. "You belong wherever I put you," he said, though the words lacked their usual bite. They sounded almost like a promise. "And tonight, you belong among the living." He reached out to clasp the bracelet around her wrist, his fingers cool against her skin. As he leaned into fumbling with the small silver latch, a tiny vibrant spark caught the edge of Sable's vision. It wasn't a neon light. It was a pinprick of concentrated infrared, dancing across the white fabric of her coat. It settled directly over her heart, a silent, glowing ruby of impending violence. "Jean!" she gasped, her body locking tight. He didn't need to ask. He saw the red bead on her chest and his entire aura shifted in a millisecond. The human she had seen in the library vanished, replaced by a terrifying, high-velocity predator. Before Sable could scream, Jin's hand was at the back of her neck, shoving her downward with a violent, protective force. "Down!" he roared, his voice cutting through the market's roar like a gunshot. He threw his own body over hers, pinning her against the damp cobblestones behind the heavy wooden frame of the jewelry stall. A suppressed thwip hissed through the air, followed by the crystalline shatter of the glass display case inches above their heads. Shards of amber and glass rained down on them like frozen sparks. The market erupted into chaos. Screams tore through the air as the crowd realized the sound wasn't a firework. Jean didn't flinch. He pulled a handgun from his waistband with a fluid, practiced motion, his eyes scanning the horizon of the rooftops with a terrifying, cold focus. His injured shoulder bled through his shirt, the exertion tearing the stitches she had so carefully placed, but he seemed fueled by the pain rather than slowed by it. "Stay behind me," he hissed, his voice vibrating with a raw, primal rage Sable had never heard. "Do not move until I tell you. If you breathe because I allow it. Do you understand?" He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the world that had dared to touch what was his. His protective instinct wasn't just about safety. It was a claim of ownership written in lead and blood. Sable huddled in the dirt, the smell of his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of gunpowder, realizing that the normal life he had tried to show her was dead. There were no more markets, no more fans, and no more glass beads. There was only the man standing over her, and the war he was prepared to wage to keep her alive. The estate was no longer a home. It was a fortress under siege. The heavy steel shutters had been lowered over every window, sealing the interior into a tomb of velvet and shadows. The only light came from the dying embers in the library fireplace, casting long flickering ghosts across the rows of leather-bound books. Outside, the world was a chaos of sirens and rain, but inside, the silence was heavy enough to drown in. Jean sat on the floor, his back against the mahogany desk, his legs stretched out before him. He had refused to go to the infirmary. He had refused his guards. He only permitted Sable to be near him, though she felt less like a companion and more like a survivor huddled in the wreckage of a storm. "The stitches held," she whispered, her hands still trembling as she packed away the fresh bandages. The scent of copper and antiseptic was becoming the permanent perfume of their lives. "But you're burning up, Jean." "It's not the fever," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. "It's the adrenaline. It's the only thing that's kept me upright for 15 years. Sable sat cross-legged opposite him, the distance between them shrinking in the oppressive dark. "Elias said the Crane Syndicate wants to balance a ledger. What did you take from them?" Jean let out a low, humorless bark of a laugh. "Everything. I took their pride, their territory, and eventually their air. But they forget why I started taking in the first place." He turned his head toward her, his face half hidden in shadow, looking like a marble statue of a fallen god. "You think I was born with a silver tongue and a bloodied suit, Sable? I was a boy who watched his father beg for a life that wasn't worth the bullet it cost to end it." He reached out, his fingers tracing a jagged scar on his forearm that disappeared beneath his sleeve. "The world doesn't give you a seat at the table because you ask politely. It gives you a seat because you've burned every other chair in the room. I became a monster so that I wouldn't have to be a victim. I traded my soul for the power to ensure no one could ever make me beg again. But at what cost? Sable asked, her voice cracking. You're a prisoner in your own house. You can't even buy a glass bead in a market without someone trying to put a hole in your heart. The cost was everything, he admitted, his voice dropping to a raw, jagged whisper. Until you. The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Jean reached across the small gap between them, his hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that was more terrifying than his rage. His thumb brushed over her lower lip, his touch hesitant, as if he were handling something made of spun glass. I thought I had removed every weakness, he said, his dark eyes searching hers. I thought I was untouchable because I had nothing left to lose. Then you walked into that office with your defiant eyes and your steady hands, and I realized I had left a door unlocked. Now they know. They saw me move for you today. They saw the monster flinch. Sable didn't pull away. She leaned into his palm, the heat of his skin a grounding force against the cold dread in her stomach. You didn't flinch, Jean. You saved me. In my world, that's the same thing, he rasped. He pulled her closer until their foreheads rested against each other. In the absolute dark of the lockdown room, the titles and the terror stripped away, leaving only two people breathing the same air, waiting for a dawn that felt like it might never come. For the first time, Sable understood that the cage wasn't built to keep her in. It was built to keep his remaining humanity from leaking out. The silence of the estate was not broken by a sound, but by a sudden jarring absence. The low-frequency hum of the HVAC system and the subtle glow of the emergency floor lights vanished simultaneously, plunging the library into a blackness so thick it felt physical. In the vacuum of sound that followed, the high-security locks on the heavy mahogany doors gave a synchronized electronic click, the sound of a system being overridden, not by force but by a command. Jean was moving before Sable could even gasp. His hand, previously gentle on her jaw, snapped to the back of her head, pulling her down into the footwell of the desk. Don't breathe, he hissed, the vulnerability of their shared confession replaced instantly by a lethal focused chill. The backup generators, Sable whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Why haven't they? Because it wasn't a failure, Jean cut her off, his voice a ghost of a sound. It was a handoff. Someone opened the veins of this house from the inside. A soft thud vibrated through the floorboards from the grand foyer, followed by the metallic slide of a suppressed bolt being racked. Then another. The black cranes weren't just at the gates. They were in the marrow of the home. The internal security cameras, the motion sensors, the pressure plates, everything Jean had relied on to keep the world at bay, had been turned into a blindfold. Jean pulled a secondary firearm from a hidden holster beneath the desk and pressed it into Sable's hand. The cold steel felt heavy and wrong. If the door opens and it isn't me, he said, his eyes finding hers even in the gloom, you pull the trigger until it stops clicking. Do you hear me? Jean, don't leave me, she pleaded, her fingers trembling around the grip. I'm not leaving you. I'm clearing a path. He rose with the silence of a shadow, his movements fluid despite his stiff shoulder. He didn't go for the main door. Instead, he pressed a sequence into a hidden panel behind a row of encyclopedias, and a section of the shelving pivoted inward. The air from the secret passageway smelled of cold stone and old dust. Before he stepped through, he paused, looking back at her. The moonlight, silver and sharp, managed to find a gap in the steel shutters, illuminating the hard line of his jaw. He looked like the monster he had claimed to be, but the look in his eyes was one of desperate, frantic protection. A floorboard creaked just outside the library door. Then came the sound of a voice, low, distorted by a comms unit. The boss is in the library. Take the girl alive. The boss stays for the ledger. The realization turned Sable's blood to ice. It wasn't Elias's voice, but it was familiar. One of the younger guards she had seen every morning. The betrayal was total. Jean stepped into the passage, pulling the shelf shut just as the library's main doors were kicked off their hinges with a violent crash. Sable curled into a ball beneath the desk, the weight of the gun in her hand the only thing keeping her from drifting into a state of shock. Heavy tactical boots crunched on the glass shards left over from the night before. Beams of tactical flashlights sliced through the darkness, dancing over the leather chairs and the blood-stained rug. She could hear them breathing, the rhythmic artificial rasp of men in gas masks. "He's not here," a voice growled, barely 3 feet from where she hid. "Check the desk." The flashlight beam swept toward her hiding spot, the circle of white light growing larger and brighter on the floorboards. Sable squeezed her eyes shut, her finger tightening on the trigger. The human gene had shown her now a distant memory compared to the nightmare currently hunting them in the dark. Sable didn't wait for the flashlight to find her. The moment the beam licked the edge of the mahogany desk, she rolled toward the wall, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She remembered the secret latch Jean had used, the third encyclopedia from the left, bound in cracked green leather. Her fingers fumbled in the dark, finding the cold metal lever. With a hiss of pressurized air, the shelf swung wide enough for her to slip through just as a gloved hand gripped the edge of the desk. She pulled the panel shut, the click of the lock muffled by the thick stone walls. The passage was a narrow throat of shadows, smelling of damp earth and ancient wood. She wasn't just running. She was navigating the skeletal remains of a house she had studied in Jin's architectural blueprints weeks ago. She knew where the service ducts met the wine cellar, and more importantly, she knew where Jean had tucked Jia away for safety. Jia was curled in a small, soundproofed panic room disguised as a linen closet in the north wing. When Sable slid the panel open, the young girl looked up, her eyes wide pools of terror. "Sable," Jia whispered, clutching a tattered velvet rabbit to her chest. "Don't say a word," Sable breathed, pulling the girl into the crawl space. "We have to move. The shadows are our friends now." While Sable led Jia through the veins of the estate, the heart of the house was screaming. From the ventilation grates, the sounds of Jin's war rose in a terrifying crescendo. In the grand lobby, Jean was a ghost of vengeance. He had discarded the sophisticated veneer of a businessman, moving through the darkness like a blade forged in a furnace. The black cranes had expected a cornered animal. They found a storm. The lobby erupted in the staccato rhythm of gunfire, and the wet thud of bone hitting marble. Jean used the environment with a brutal, intimate knowledge. He didn't just fire, he orchestrated. He triggered the fire suppression system, turning the air into a thick, blinding mist of chemical foam. In the whiteout, he became a shadow among shadows. Sable paused by a grate, looking down into the foyer. She saw Jean emerge from the fog behind a mercenary, his movement so fast it was almost beautiful in its lethality. He didn't waste a single motion. His injured shoulder bled freely now, painting his white shirt in a grotesque sash of red. But he fought as if the pain were merely fuel. He was the sword that kept the world from her throat, a man who had become a monster to kill the monsters at his door. "He's coming for us," Jia whimpered, feeling the vibrations of a distant explosion through the stone. "He's making away," Sable corrected, her voice steadying. She looked at the gun Jean had given her, then at the girl. She realized then that Jean was the sword, but she had to be the shield. They reached the final junction, a heavy iron door that led toward the underground garage. Sable could hear the frantic shouting of the remaining crane soldiers as they realized their perimeter was collapsing. Jin's voice rang out through the intercom system, distorted and low, echoing through every hallway. "You came into my house to take what is mine," the voice growled, sounding more like an ancient curse than a man. "Now you will never leave." Sable pushed Jia toward the exit, her hand tight on the pistol. She could see the flickering emergency lights of the garage ahead. Between them and freedom stood a single mercenary, his rifle raised. Sable didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the human beneath the suit or the monster in the lobby. She thought of the man who had bled for her in the library. She raised the weapon, her hands perfectly steady, and pulled the trigger. The silence that followed the final echo of gunfire was more profound than any noise that had preceded it. The estate, once a theater of shadows and calculated cruelty, felt hollowed out, its dark secrets purged by the violence of the night. In the cold light of the following morning, the black cranes were gone, their presence erased by the efficiency of those few guards who had remained loyal. But the house had changed. The air no longer felt heavy with the scent of impending betrayal. It felt clean, like the atmosphere after a fever finally breaks. Jean stood in the center of the charred library, his arm in a fresh sling, his face mapped with the bruises of a war he had finally finished. He didn't look like a king among ruins. He looked like a man who had put down a weight he had been carrying since childhood. "It's over," he said as Sable and Jia entered the room. His voice was sandpaper and silk, weary but resonant with a new kind of authority, one that didn't require a weapon to enforce. He had summoned the heads of the remaining loyalist factions that morning, not to command them, but to dismiss them. He had liquidated the holdings, burned the ledgers, and dismantled the machinery of his empire with the same cold precision he had used to build it. He told them the king was dead, and that they were free to fight over the crown, but that the territory of this house was no longer part of their world. "You're walking away," Sable said, standing by the shattered window where the sun was beginning to fight through the winter clouds. "Everything you built. You're just leaving it?" "I didn't build an empire, Sable," Jean replied, walking toward her with a slow, measured gait. "I built a cage. I thought if I owned the world it couldn't hurt me. But the only things worth having are the things I can't buy with blood." He looked at Jia, who was sitting on a stack of saved books, sunlight catching the gold in her hair. She was safe. For the first time, she wasn't a pawn in a grand strategy. She was just a child. Months passed like a slow inhalation of breath. The estate was sold. The stone and steel exchanged for a villa perched on a cliffside where the salt air was the only thing that tasted of copper. The tailored charcoal suits were replaced by soft linens, and the silence was no longer a tactical necessity, but a luxury. On a late afternoon, the Mediterranean sun drenched the stone balcony in a honeyed glow. Sable sat with a sketchpad in her lap, her fingers no longer trembling. The amber bracelet Jean had given her in the night market glinted on her wrist, a reminder of the night the world broke and began to heal. Jean stepped out from the tall glass doors, 2 glasses of water in his hand. He looked younger, the harsh lines around his eyes softened by the light. He sat beside her, his hand finding hers with an easy, unforced familiarity. There was no perimeter to maintain, no shadows to scan. Jia was down on the lower terrace, her laughter drifting up on the breeze as she chased a butterfly through the lavender. "Is this real?" Sable asked softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Jean squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing the pulse point he had once held in the library when he was bleeding out. "It's the only real thing I've ever had." They sat together in the warmth, a family forged not by bloodline, but by the fire they had walked through together. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky so clear it was almost blinding. The boss was gone and the monster had been laid to rest. In their place was a man who had finally learned that the greatest power wasn't in the taking, but in the keeping of the people he loved. If this story made you feel something, please like the video and subscribe to this channel for more.